Today we come to another matter that has become rather controversial in the modern world. Paul's words are considered so out of date that it can be extremely difficult even to have a measured discussion on the subject of the role of woman in the church. However, if we believe in the inspiration of the scriptures, and I certainly do, we have to bow to the fact that our only authority on these matters is the Bible, rather than the changing fashions of our increasingly secular society. So, with that in mind, let us read from 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verses 33 to 35. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Let your woman keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. You've maybe heard the proverb, silence is golden. Well, it's actually half a proverb. The full wording, as I understand, is speaking is silver, but silence is golden. The idea behind this saying is that there can be a greater value in silence than there is in sound. Now, if that is true, silence ought not to be thought of as devaluing someone, but rather as conferring a particular value upon them, a value that we saw in chapter 11, where a woman has the particular honour of displaying the submission of Christ to God. Now, Paul refers to the importance of silence on 3 occasions in this part of the chapter. 3 circumstances where silence is required in the meetings of the assembly. The first one is in verse 28. Let him, that is, the person who wishes to speak in tongues, keep silence in the church. It is a silence of operation. The second one is in verse 30. Let the first, that is, prophet, hold his peace. It is a silence of opportunity. So the third one is the particularly contentious one. Let your woman keep silence in the churches in verse 34. It is the silence of divine order. So the reason why Paul brings it in at this point is because God is not the author of confusion, verse 33. Or, as the NET says, God is not characterized by disorder. Assembly meetings should be characterized by decorum, and that is the case everywhere, as in all churches of the saints, Paul writes in verse 33. This is not an instruction only relevant to Corinth. If it is God's assembly, and it is, then let God's order be followed wherever that might be. Now, though modern society will immediately ask the question, why should a woman be silent? Paul does not go into a detailed explanation either here or in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 11, where he wrote, let the woman learn in silence, and I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, 1 Timothy 2 verse 12. But he does give us a clue there when he refers to God's order in creation. Adam was first formed, then Eve, verse 13. Now, I think Paul may be alluding to that in this passage where he writes, as also saith the law, verse 34. The meetings of the assembly should reflect God's creation order, not the disorder brought in by sin, and that is why this silence is golden. Finally, please note that Paul writes in the churches, verse 34, and in the church, verse 35. In other words, when the whole church be come together into one place, as he wrote in verse 23. That, of course, is not the sum and substance of the life of the assembly. Women are not commanded to be silent in their homes, in their neighbourhoods, or in their communities. They have a full part to play in the life of the assembly within the roles that God has given to them. Now, important though it is, I worry that an overemphasis on the meetings of the assembly can inadvertently give the sense that a Christian woman has a very minor role in spiritual things. But that is not the case. Paul expects that a Christian woman should want to learn and should have opportunity to pursue her spiritual education when he writes, if they will learn anything, in verse 35. And she is able to teach others in her own home, as Paul instructs in Titus chapter 2, verse 4. And the example of Priscilla demonstrates in Acts chapter 18, verse 26. In the Garden of Eden, the work of Satan was to focus Eve's mind on the one prohibition that God made in respect of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, rather than on the abundance of what he had provided. Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, Genesis chapter 2, verse 16. I fear that we are in danger of repeating that same mistake in the approach that is adopted to these scriptures in our modern day, and I hope it is not a mistake that we want to make.